So far we have looked at classical conditioning, which can explain a lot of our simple behavioral responses, but it can't explain some of our more complex behaviors. So, for example, the motivation to get up in the morning and getting dressed, doing household chores, doing our homework. Classical conditioning can't explain how we learn certain behaviors that are essential parts of our daily life. It can explain how new stimuli can elicit existing behaviors, but it cannot explain how we learn new behaviors. To understand that type of learning, we need to look at operant conditioning. So this is a type of learning proposed by B.F. Skinner. He suggested that organisms learn responses that operate on the environment to produce consequences. So this is where the term operant conditioning comes from. Basically, in operant conditioning, organisms learn to associate a behavior and its consequences. And that consequence can either be reinforcement or punishment, which we are going to talk about in detail in this video. So, whereas in classical conditioning, learning results from the association between two stimuli, in operant conditioning, learning results from the association between a behavior and its consequence. Now, this is based on the law of effect proposed by Thorndike. So this suggests that the tendency for a response to occur depends on the effects it has on the environment. So if something has a pleasant or a desired consequence, then the behavior is more likely to occur again. If, however, it's an unpleasant or an undesired consequence, then the behavior is less likely to occur again. So basically, Skinner is suggesting that we are motivated by the consequences our behaviors have. Over time, we learn what those consequences are, and that will determine whether or not we are motivated to engage in that behavior again or not. So as an example, when we show up to work, we get paid. Okay, showing up to work is the behavior, getting paid is the pleasant consequence that motivates us to continue to show up to work. If we weren't getting paid, then we're probably going to lose that motivation. We're less likely to engage in that behavior again. So, in operant conditioning, just to summarize, organisms learn that certain responses or certain behaviors have consequences. They produce certain effects, and these consequences will determine the likelihood that a behavior will occur again. If the consequence is rewarding, then we will engage in that behavior again, and it could essentially become a habit over time. And if it's not, then we are much less likely to engage in that behavior. Now, in order to study this, Skinner conducted experiments primarily with rats and pigeons to determine how this type of conditioning occurs. So to do this, he would place animals inside an operant conditioning chamber, which is now more commonly known as a Skinner box. So this is a box containing a food dispensing mechanism. Basically, it would release food when the animal responded in certain ways. So for example, pushing a lever or pushing a button. In some scenarios, they would have either a loud sound or lights that would bother the animal, and they would have to behave in a way that would get those things removed. I apologize, my dogs are barking in the background right now. Hey, shh. Okay, where was I? So basically he was looking to see whether or not the animal would make these associations between their behaviors and the consequences, and if they were, what you would expect to see is an increase in that behavior. And that is exactly, or a decrease in the behavior, depending on whether he's using a reinforcement or punishment. But for example, if the animal is making the association that, oh, every time I press this lever, food pops out, then you should see an increase in them pressing the lever, and that is what he found. They were making that association. Or they were learning that, oh, every time this bright light comes on, if I touch this lever, then it turns them off. They're making that association between the behavior and the consequence. So, as I already mentioned, when we're talking about the consequences of a behavior in operant conditioning, it can be one of two things. It can be reinforcement or punishment. So reinforcement, or a reinforcer, is anything that increases the likelihood of a behavior occurring again. There's usually some kind of reward that is either added or taken away, which then motivates us to continue engaging in that behavior. Now, both reinforcement and punishment can be positive or negative, but these terms are not used the same way here that we usually use them. They mean something else. So instead, positive means something is being added, negative means something is being taken away. So in the case of reinforcement, positive reinforcement means some kind of reward is being added that increases the likelihood of a behavior happening. So for example, if you study for an exam and you get a high grade, you get an A on that exam, that is positive reinforcement. You are more likely to study for the next exam because you're learning that there are positive consequences to studying. Training dogs. We're going to talk a lot about training dogs in this chapter. Every time the dog engages in the behavior that you're looking for, you reward them. You give them a treat so that they are then more likely to engage in that behavior again. You're hoping that they make that association between, oh, when I do this, this is what they're looking for, and then they get that reward. Likes on social media, that positively reinforces you, that makes you more likely to post again. If no one ever likes your photos, then you're going to probably feel a little less motivated to post them. A couple of other examples, I already mentioned paychecks, getting paid for work, obviously motivates us to keep working. Praise, being told that we're good at something or being complimented on something makes us more likely to engage in that behavior again because it feels good to be praised. Now, negative reinforcement means something unpleasant is being removed. Engaging in the behavior removes something unpleasant, and as a result, you're more likely to engage in that behavior again. So, for example, when you sit in the car and you don't put your seatbelt on, there's that annoying beeping sound. Putting your seatbelt on makes that stop. Okay, so when you put that on, the beeping sound stops. You make that association. You know, okay, if I want that sound to stop, I need to put my seatbelt on. You are then more likely to put your seatbelt on every time. When you get a headache, you take an aspirin, it disappears. That unpleasant headache is being removed, and so you learn that the aspirin is effective, and that the next time you have that headache, you are more likely to take aspirin again because you know it's going to remove it. Now, in both cases, whether you're using positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, the key point here is that you are increasing the likelihood of a behavior occurring. Something that I do want to highlight is that reinforcement can be a kind of two-way street. And the best way for me to explain what I mean by this is with an example. Let's say you have a mum and a child go into a store and the child starts crying and they won't stop, and the parent desperately wants to make them stop, so they decide to buy them a toy, okay? And that works. The child stops crying. In one sense, that is negative reinforcement. It negatively reinforces the mum to buy the child a toy the next time it cries because she's learning that it works. Oh, if I buy the child a toy, they stop crying, so I'm going to do that again. Okay, increasing the likelihood of her buying a toy because it removes something unpleasant. It removes the crying. However, this is also a form of positive reinforcement for the child's behavior. The child is going to learn that if they cry, they get a toy. They're being rewarded. They're being given something, which is why it's positive. And that is then going to increase the likelihood of them crying the next time they go into the store. Okay, so it can go both ways, and it's important to be aware of that. At this point, I recommend pausing, or you can come back to this after you've watched the whole video and watched this. It's a clip from The Big Bang Theory where Sheldon is trying to train Penny with positive reinforcement. So that's a good example of what we've just been talking about. Now, the next thing to know about reinforcers is that they can be categorized into one of two types: primary reinforcers and secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers are reinforcers that are naturally rewarding because they satisfy some kind of biological need. So, for example, food is a primary reinforcer because we have a biological need for food and it satisfies that. anything that is pleasurable, or even affection. We have a human need for affection, so getting affection from people would be a primary reinforcer that isn't listed on here. Water. Think about when you're super thirsty, you've just worked out, and you desperately need a drink. Think about how pleasurable that water is, or how good that feels, or how reinforcing that is. You are then more likely to engage in that behavior the next time you feel that way. So anything that's meeting some form of biological need is a primary reinforcer. And that doesn't need to necessarily just be biological in terms of, needing food, needing water, needing to reproduce, needing sleep. We also have primary needs for novel stimuli. Our brain needs a certain amount of stimulation. We have a need for pleasurable experiences. So when I talk about biological needs, to some extent, that also includes our psychological needs, our primary psychological needs. Secondary reinforcers do not satisfy any kind of biological or psychological need by themselves, but they acquire reinforcement value because of their association with a primary reinforcer. So, for example, money alone isn't really any good for anything. It's not going to meet any need by itself, but we learn that we can exchange money for basic reinforcers, for primary reinforcers. We can use it for food, we can use it for shelter, we can use it for water, we can use it to buy pleasurable experiences. So although it doesn't meet a need itself, it does so through its association with other reinforcers. Good grades, awards, recognition, we equate that with success, and with success comes hopefully a good job and money, which again can be used to meet primary needs or biological needs. And then things like smile and praise tie into that need for affection that we have. Okay. So moving on to punishment. Punishment is the opposite of in reinforcement, in that it is something that decreases the likelihood of a behavior occurring again. And again, this can be by adding something, so it can be positive punishment, or by taking something away, negative punishment. So some examples of positive punishment: scolding a student for texting in class. The fact that I am scolding a student is adding something to the situation, and it's decreasing the likelihood that that student will text in class again. If you burn your tongue after eating a hot pepper, that tongue burning sensation is what's being added to the situation, and it's going to decrease the likelihood of you engaging in that behavior again because it's unpleasant. You don't want to, and it burns. You don't want that. So it's reducing the likelihood of that behavior. Negative punishment, so something is being removed, which then decreases the likelihood of the behavior. So usually something pleasant is being taken away. So for example, if a child misbehaves, you can take away a child's toy. That is going to decrease the likelihood of them misbehaving again because they don't want their toy taken away. You could also give them a timeout. That is removing whatever stimulation they had at the time, because you're removing them from whatever activity they were engaging in. But also with a timeout, you are removing your affection. You are ignoring them for that time. You're making them spend time alone. So you're removing attention, you are removing mental stimulation, you are removing something that they enjoy. Any one of those is negative punishment because you are decreasing the likelihood of that behavior occurring again, of them misbehaving, by taking something that they like away. Now, again, I have another clip here that follows on from the last Big Bang Theory clip. Usually I show this to you and I have you tell me what they get wrong in this, but as we don't have that opportunity, I'm going to share with you ahead of time what they get wrong. It's actually something that quite commonly gets mistaken. People will use the term negative reinforcement when they actually mean positive punishment, and that's what they do here. They use the term negative reinforcement and they talk about administering electric shocks to reduce the unlikable behaviors that they want to remove. The fact that they're trying to reduce behaviors means it's punishment. The fact that they would use electric shocks, which is adding something to the situation, makes it positive punishment. Okay, so it is not, when they say negative reinforcement, they are using that term incorrectly. Now, throughout the two videos, you will hear them talk about removing behaviors, but what they're doing is, rather than just simply removing that behavior, what they're trying to do, and this is commonly how kind of these child training techniques work, instead of removing the negative behavior, they are trying to replace it with a positive behavior. So rather than just punishing her for using a high-pitched voice, what they do is reward her for using a low-pitched voice. So they're using positive reinforcement to increase the likelihood of her using a low-pitched voice, and in doing that, they are then decreasing the high-pitched voice. But that one moment when they talk about negative reinforcement, just be aware that that's the incorrect term to use. So you can watch that and let me know if you have any questions. Something I just want to spend a couple of minutes discussing is the drawbacks of punishment, because although both of these, reinforcement and punishment, can be used to increase or decrease the behaviors you want to get from, a child, a dog, whatever it is you're training, whoever it is you're trying to change your behavior in, usually reinforcement is the preferred approach. It's more successful, and there are less negative side effects. There are, as we're going to discuss, certain drawbacks of using punishment, and I just want you to be aware of that. If it's something you're thinking about using, you need to think about when and how and the side effects of that. So, 1, punishment may suppress undesirable behavior, but it doesn't eliminate it. Let's say you have a child that curses a lot and you want to reduce that behavior. You want to stop them cursing. The problem with only using punishment is that it will most likely suppress that behavior around you or around the parents, but chances are the child is going to continue to curse at school. So just be aware that it might suppress it. It might not necessarily eliminate the behavior. It might just suppress it around you to avoid punishment. 2, punishment does not teach new behaviors. This is an important one, because in some cases, yes, you might want to be using punishment to remove a behavior, but you need to think about, well, what was that behavior achieving? Was it meeting some kind of need? Because if you remove that behavior and don't replace it with a new one, then how is that need going to be met? So an important example for this one is, let's say you have a child that has difficulties regulating their emotions or regulating difficult emotions, and they have this tendency to lash out, and maybe they start hitting people when they get angry. If parents simply punish them for that, maybe that stops the child lashing out. Maybe it reduces the likelihood of them hitting other people, but it's still not teaching the child how to then deal with those difficult emotions in the future. And as a result, what you'll most likely see in this scenario is the child will then internalize those emotions. They won't express them anymore because they're too scared to. And if you internalize those types of emotions, you see an increase in rates of depression and anxiety. So simply eliminating that negative behavior is not teaching them a new way to deal with those difficult emotions. So it's important to consider, okay, yes, maybe I can use punishment to remove this behavior, but how am I going to teach a replacement for this behavior? 3, punishment can have undesirable consequences. Okay, one example we have just discussed, if you are punishing a child's way of expressing their emotions but don't teach them a new one, they'll internalize them and you could see signs of depression and anxiety. Also, with too much punishment, you might see a child develop very low self-esteem. They might develop a fear of their parents because they're so scared of doing the wrong thing and being punished. And that in turn can then result in very difficult family relationships. So it's just a few examples of undesirable consequences. 4, punishment may become abusive. Maybe in the beginning, that's not the intention, but punishment in itself, if it's working, that becomes reinforcing. If a parent realizes, oh, when I punish my kid, this works, I get the result that I want, then the parent is more likely to think, okay, I'm going to use this in future. Maybe that works for a while, maybe that low level of punishment works for a while, but if the child eventually adapts to that and it's not having any effect, then you might see parents increase the level of punishment and you'll start to see that escalation happening. 5, punishment may represent a form of inappropriate modeling. So we're going to talk about what modeling means in another video, but essentially the parent is the model. They are modeling behaviors that the child will observe and will copy. And so you may have heard, a lot of bullies in school, they behave that way because that's how they're treated at home. There's a lot of truth to that. That might not necessarily be the case for every bully, but I imagine in many cases, yes, that is what you see, because the child learns that that is an appropriate behavior. If the parent is verbally or physically punishing them at home, the child assumes that it's okay to treat other people that way, and they're going to copy that behavior. So just being aware that whatever kind of punishment you use, your child may learn that it's okay to behave that way around others. Okay. So the last thing to end this video, I would usually go through these and have you give me the answers, but I'm going to do that for you to help you better understand this distinction between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So the first example, a very bright, mildly painful light is turned on a rat. The rat has learned that he can turn off the light by pressing a lever on the other side of his cage. As soon as the light comes on, the rat runs across the room and presses the lever. So this is, of course, operant conditioning. This is kind of an example of what Skinner would do with his Skinner box. More specifically, this is negative reinforcement. The reason being is the behavior is pressing the lever, and that is being increased because the rat learns that that then turns off that mildly painful light. Okay, so by pressing the lever, something unpleasant is removed, and so the rat is more likely to engage in that behavior again in order to remove that light. Second example, when a mother strokes her infant's skin, the stroking creates pleasure responses in the baby. After this goes on for many days, the baby begins to show pleasure responses simply at the sight of the mother before even being touched. So this is classical conditioning because the association here is between two stimuli, specifically between the mother stroking the infant and the sight of the mother. So the mother stroking the infant's skin is our unconditioned stimulus. That is what automatically creates this pleasure response in the baby. And so the pleasure response is our unconditioned response. It automatically occurs when the mother strokes the infant's skin. The sight of the mother initially is the neutral stimulus, but eventually that gets paired with the mother stroking the infant's skin. And so as a result, the sight of the mother is now the conditioned stimulus that creates the pleasure response. And so the pleasure response is now the conditioned response because it's in response to the sight of the mother rather than just in response to the mother stroking the infant's skin. The last example, so Mr. and Mrs. Jones are having a heated argument that both are finding very unpleasant. Mr. Jones gets up and leaves the room, closing the door behind him. This has the effect of terminating the argument. From then on, every time Mrs. Jones raises her voice, Mr. Jones leaves the room. So this, again, is operant conditioning, and it is also negative reinforcement again. Something unpleasant is being removed. So by getting up and leaving the room, Mr. Jones is terminating the argument. So that unpleasantness of the argument is being taken away. As a result, Mr. Jones is now more likely to do that in future. Every time Mrs. Jones raises her voice, he's going to leave the room. So the likelihood of him leaving the room is increased because it reduces the argument.